Hi, I'm John Cuddeback.
And I'm Sofia Cuddeback.
If you're wondering whether you can really be friends with your spouse
and raise children into responsible adults with whom you have a relationship
and do what it takes to make a homestead, reconnecting with your body and the land wherever you live.
If you just want to think more about how to make a truly happy home in our trying times,
then The Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast, is for you. Join us. Welcome to this episode. Today's episode is, what if my spouse is not on the same page? Well, it's a little awkward. I'm looking at my spouse right now. What inspired us to ask this question, one might wonder. Sophia, glad to be together again.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
What do you think? Do you think that we are going to talk about this from personal experience?
Oh, I'm sure there'll be some of that for sure.
I think so too. Well, let me say why I particularly am interested to do this topic, because I've suffered under it for so many years. No, just kidding. So I shouldn't joke about this. Well, sometimes it is good to be able to joke about difficult things, but all spouses are certainly, to some degree, going to have to deal with the issue of not sharing the exact same ideals. And the more that we have high ideals that we're aiming for, the more that this will come into play. I certainly feel like I should say I have heard with some regularity this coming from a wife. I have certainly heard this more from a wife than I have from a husband. It's not that you don't hear it from a husband, but what do I do when my husband and so often when I've heard it, it's the wife doesn't want to throw her husband under the bus, but she's dealing with something real. She normally, I think, and again, it's just so interesting, how often, this is very much the case in my experience, I've met these women who think about these things a lot. They think about marriage. They think about household. I think that very often women are more tuned in to relationship and the relationships in the household. And again, it's not universal, but I think broadly, that's one reason for this somewhat divergence in experience. And having thought about it, they have these kind of high ideals. And it might just be the husband hasn't thought about it so much, and so much doesn't have his heart and mind in the game. And so he's kind of lagging behind, or the wife feels that she has to be consistently enunciating, well, this is something we want to do, don't we? Isn't this a good idea? Does that correspond with your experience?
I think that's certainly true. And part of it is that the woman, her work being primarily in the home, even if she works outside of the home, she's, responsible for so many of the details that would kind of push her into thinking more about how are we going to run things? What are we going to do? What's the principle that's going to help us organize the situation? So in a lot of ways, the details of the household kind of end up affecting her in a more active way. So of course she's thinking about them more. That having been said though, I think it's equally as difficult for a man if his wife is not on the same page. I wonder if also part of the reason we don't hear about it as much, I think men have a little bit less of a tendency to kind of share something like that, or kind of inner sufferings or difficulties in their marriage, than women do. I think women tend to go and look for help a little bit more than men do. So I wouldn't be surprised if part of that is just, it's a little bit of a male dynamic to not really bring that to the surface, or to even discuss it as an issue. So that could be part of the reason that we hear about it more from women than from men.
Okay. So what are we going to do here? It seems to me, I think there'll be at least, we're going to focus maybe first on a woman being in a situation where her husband isn't on the same page. But first of all, many things we say there would apply going the other way.
Of course, yeah.
And we're going to circle back, and I think each of us can give our own perspective. I suppose we can each give our own perspective on both. What's our hope herein? To help all of us think more clearly about how, first of all, this is not a shocking situation to be in, though for some people, let's be frank, it is going to be a very hard one. I mean, look, some of the situations that I've looked at here, it really is a situation where it's a fruit of a lot of thought, a lot of deliberation, one spouse really has some strong convictions about what to do and just doesn't really feel that while it's not direct contradiction, the other spouse is just not really there in it in the same way, and even just that less intensity um, can really hurt. You can really feel it because it just makes a difference of being fully in it together.
Yeah.
Because we want to be fully in these things together, especially things that are close to our heart. And very often this is something that's closest to our heart, what we're going to do together in marriage, in our home together, in our relationship. Look, when this has to do with, first of all, the most important relationship in the household is between spouses. If one spouse has a sense of we have really something to work on here, and they're just kind of like, well, whatever, okay, it's not perfect, but we're doing okay. That already can be a real challenge.
Yeah, I think the analogy that comes to my mind is if you inflate your tires to different pressure, you get a really bumpy ride.
Yeah, okay.
And so, if both spouses don't have the same interest in things or same degree of interest in or different interests. Now, I would note that some of the reasons that maybe you can have that difference, it's not just bad will. And in most cases, it's actually not bad will. It can be something as straightforward as a difference in temperament. You can have a very driven, one of the spouses can be very choleric, very driven, and the other can be a more phlegmatic spouse. In which case, the one that's up and at 'em and really wants to take care of business can experience great frustration that the other spouse is moving more slowly. So I think it's good to take into consideration too. There are a lot of reasons why this happens. Maybe we won't so specifically delve into all the different reasons that it happens, but I just want to underscore that it's not necessarily because one or the other of the spouses has bad will,
or is in some way really failing.
right?
Although it could be, and we'll try to look at some different situations there. But maybe we should say what we're not going to do. This is not going to be about saving a marriage that's falling apart because of these fundamental differences between spouses. So the context for asking the question, kind of, what if my spouse is not on the same page, is generally we're taking as given that we share the most basic principles in common. And if we were to enunciate out loud what's most important to us in life, in our marriage, in the home, we'd pretty much answer with the same things. But nonetheless, details matter. And so we're interested here in those differences, often kind of within intentional households, within an intentional marriage, that there's a genuine divergence that makes it hard to know what to do next, right? Because if to what extent, obviously a big issue here is to what extent do I try to move forward without the spouse being on the same page versus how much time and energy do I spend rather trying to get the spouse on the same page and only then move forward. So I think we need to sort that out a little bit. So where should we start? I mean, I'm inclined to start with, again, something that I feel like I've commonly seen. The most common one that jumps to my mind is a situation where, say, a wife has some pretty specific ideas about how to raise the children and things that the children need. And a motivation, a strong sense, not just of the particular things that need to be done, but kind of why they need to be done, and that taking proactive steps in a very challenging situation that we're in a culture that throws so many things in our way, that this is a big part of what we need to be doing now with our children, often rooted in maybe a wife's special closeness to feeling the pain or seeing things that are not going so well in this child's life or that child's life. And so now wants to address it and finds, okay, I have a sense that we have a problem and that we need to be doing something about it. And I have these specific ideas. And it's hard to even get my husband to talk about this because he frankly doesn't even really seem to want to hear that we have a problem, because he doesn't really see it and thinks I'm just maybe being hypersensitive, over worried, and boom. Now what do we do?
Yeah, great. I think that's a great place to start.
Great. Well, what do you think?
Oh, wait a minute.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, this is what happens to you all the time, right? So, I mean, come on, you've been there. I'm just over here going bo bo bo, and you're trying to get me to recognize something.
No, go ahead. You go ahead and start.
Well, okay. I mean, what normally have I said when someone brings that situation to me?
Mhm.
The first question I ask is, have you really taken the time to articulate what you're thinking, to step back and not do it in a way that is kind of in the moment and kind of maybe more taking the form of a complaint, kind of why aren't you with with me in this, or kind of a harping on we need to do something about this. But have you really first stopped and at the right time, again, not in the heat of maybe already a disagreement, gone and said, dear, we need to talk about something. There's something that I see, something that's very important to me, something I really have a conviction about, and I need to tell you, I'm not seeing that our minds and hearts are meeting here, and this is very hard for me. Maybe we're not going to end up at the same place, but I need you in any case to understand why I'm here. I need to experience myself as heard. That's
Mhm.
the first question that I ask. Maybe you haven't really kind of patiently taken the time to recognize that in God's great providence in your relationship right now, this needed to come to light through you here, the wife, in our example,
Mhm.
which I happen to think is very often the case. That in the providence, though there's a kind of first responsibility and first authority with the husband, that doesn't mean, of course, that the wife doesn't very often see certain key things first that are going to come to the communal light by her bringing it to light. So,
Mhm.
first of all, have you done that? Maybe that was what needs to be done in a reasonable way that is going to bring you all together.
Mhm. Yeah. So, what I'm hearing you say, and what's it's bringing to mind, is something that you've referred back to many times in our discussions and in the previous podcasts we've done, is that prior to any other relationship in the household, the spousal relationship is really kind of prior, fundamental. And in this case, if there is a, if you don't converge on your ideals or what you desire for the household, a particular child or situation or circumstance, basically what that points to is there's something that you need to do as a couple together, one another, in your marriage. So it's good to, if you're discussing an issue, a need that the child has that maybe you feel that your husband doesn't understand, or it could be the wife, it could be either way. um, the fundamental issue, if your spouse is not on the same page with you, is that you as spouses need to get on the same page. Not necessarily that you need to be on the same page about that problem, because in the end, a
Mm-hmm.
particular problem or issue that you're trying to resolve, you may end up being in a situation where in the end you're not on the same page about it, and that certainly does happen. But that's very different. That's a very different situation than someone just kind of not being on the same page, like out to lunch about it, and this is something really important you need to take care of. So it just seems to me like what you're pointing to is, as spouses, we need to have a conversation that says, what's your page? Or, I'm on this page. I feel like you're on a different page. We need to discuss this because I'd like to be on the same page with you. And so more
Mm-hmm.
the issue is how are we as spouses going to meet in this conversation? So it's not necessarily that the result is going to be on the same page. It might,
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, sometimes there are differences, but in any case, it's coming to your spouse and inviting them. Ooh, there's something here important in my life that I'm moving forward in that I feel like you're not there. I'd like to invite you to become part of that.
Okay, then can I say something that this is the type of thing that I say in the classroom, and my students are often annoyed at it. But I think it allowed me to put it to you this way, because I think often in these situations we need to make a distinction. And listening to what you just said there, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
a great point, nonetheless we need to make explicit a distinction. There's being on the same page, and there's being on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you just said. You said, well, we might not be able to end up being on the same page, but we need to be on the same page.
Sure.
Well, then that means we have to sort out what those two different things are. And
Yeah.
and there's a fundamental being on the same page, which I think what you mean by that, and tell me if otherwise, that we need to have a certain mutual understanding and confidence in our relationship about how we relate to one another.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you mean there by, in the most important sense, we need to be on the same page. And I think this is a super important overarching distinction right now, because while it is important in the second sense, all right, let's just go ahead and say, what's the second sense of being on the same page? Well, it's agreeing about specific ideals,
Mm-hmm.
ends, or means to meet those ends, to
Mm-hmm.
seek those ends. So that's the more specific sense of being on the same page. Let's not underestimate how it is important that we try our best. I mean, obviously, we want in a relationship. Hey, Aristotle says a friendship is rooted in a certain sameness, a certain sameness of conviction. It doesn't have to be perfectly identical, but we do want to move towards coming to hopefully fundamental agreements about where we're going and how to get there. Right? That is important, and that's that more specific sense of being on the same page.
Sure.
And may I put it this way? Tell me what you think. The root sense, though, of being on the same page is, maybe to put it into words, would be like this: Hey, dear, um, I need to feel this in our relationship, and I need you to feel in our relationship that our relationship comes first. And more important than whether we agree on any particular point is that we can always have confidence in one another. First of all, that we're being heard, and that we're being heard with the ears and the eyes of love. And included in that being heard is not just, well, I hear you, but I'm also taking it to heart and really considering it, and giving it a very special consideration, precisely because it's where you are. And Aristotle says that friends, and obviously this applies in a unique way to spouses, are able to kind of take counsel together and deliberate together in their conversations in a very unique kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
precisely because of the trust and love and thus kind of security that they have with one another, and where it's never fundamentally about winning or even winning over, but it's really about just coming to see the reality the best we can together, learning from one another, in the sense it doesn't matter whose idea it was.
Mm-hmm.
That is, seems to me, that's the being on the same page
Yeah,
of we're in this together. It
absolutely.
doesn't matter. I need to always be open to learn. I need to always be open to recognize there's something I'm not seeing
Mm-hmm.
here. And if I, in our relationship, have the habit then of being ready right away, even if it doesn't appeal to me, even if it seems to be contradictory to something that I hold deeply. This is a key point in pursuing wisdom in general, to be able still to step back and to see, to learn what I don't see, to see what I don't see, to enter into your view and to work on this together. Wow. I mean, that's relationship. What a
Mm-hmm.
thing to pattern for our children. This, whether exactly we come to see eye to eye and be on the same page in that more specific sense. It's almost like, who cares?
Yeah.
Because we have this deeper, more beautiful thing.
Except for it's not, I mean, it is almost like who cares, but the chances of even those practical things being resolved more on the same page becomes
Yep.
higher
Good, very good point.
when you're meeting in a conversation of mutual respect and of willingness to see what is the other one asking of me. So I think that's really important. And yeah, I think that's how, I think you need to see it in that order, because if we try to solve the problems from the particular first, okay, well, yes, I know we need to work on our relationship, but let's solve this problem right now. It ends up being a little bit like an arm wrestling match,
Right.
and who's going to win, versus coming to an agreement. Or even if they're in the end, you say, well, I just don't agree with you on this. It's not like one has won and the other one has been vanquished,
that's
right?
a great point.
It's so
That's
I just
absolutely
think
key.
that initial, really what it boils down to is that when spouses are not on the same page in the fundamental level, it's an invitation to grow together through conversation. And isn't that a fundamental aspect of friendship?
Absolutely.
Is conversation, right? So it's a continuous invitation to conversation. I also think that the kind of things that exacerbate or make those conversations difficult, which is, I think, important to acknowledge, are things of difference between the spouses, which can be all kinds of things. We already mentioned temperamental differences. So that makes that conversation potentially much more difficult to have, so that you're not speaking past each other, so that you go into the conversation realizing my spouse fundamentally has a different way of approaching these things. And you take that into account in your conversation. Both do, one for the other. Another is that the background of the spouses, to the extent that they're more different one from the other, there's going to be a lot more conversation that needs to happen before that kind of understanding and mutual awareness, and that we're in the, obviously the conversation is we're in it together, but that kind of meeting and coming onto the same page has to take into account that there are historical differences in
Right.
background and the way
Right.
you're raised. I mean, the more same, the more common your relationship, or more you and your spouse have in common, the easier that conversation is. It doesn't ever become unnecessary because we're persons. And to that extent, we're always a little bit of a mystery to the other for the discovery. And that's what marriage is. But I think that's an important thing to take
Yeah,
account.
I think that's a great point, dear. And here's another one I want to toss out there. And so much of life is, as one of the great lines from the Oracle at Delphi is, know thyself, know thyself, know thyself, know thyself. From hidden faults, O Lord, preserve me. That we grow in what our own personal challenges are in making this work. What about me is making this situation harder? And here I have something to share. I wonder how many men are like me in this. Maybe women too are like me. It certainly can be in anybody. But for whatever reason, and we don't have to go into all the psychological aspects of it or try to pry into it, because I'm not exactly sure what it is, but this much I know, and this is big. At times, in any case, at times, it's hard for me to learn from you. And it's a funny thing. There's a lot going on there. I'm sure it has to do with my insecurities. And as a man, I think this is something that perhaps is somewhat common. Not accusing anybody other at this point other than myself, but particularly that for a man, it can be hard to learn from a woman. To be wrong, or to experience yourself as having been wrong, is hard, and one has to be a secure person in order to do that. And something I have needed and do need to recognize about myself is how at times I still feel something recoiling in myself when I discover that I'm wrong, or simply even that I haven't seen something, and that you are seeing it, and I need to see it through your eyes. I don't want to make an unnecessarily big deal of this, but I wonder how often might it be the case that, again, just to go with this direction, a wife is experiencing, why won't he learn this from me? Or why can he seem not willing to hear this? Why we're not in competition here. And all well, maybe not all, but for starters, I want to say there, let's be patient. Let's recognize this indeed might be part of it. I say to that woman right now who's struggling with that, if your husband has that problem in common with me, maybe be patient. Recognize that this might be the case, and it's going to have to be worked through. And then maybe let's roll up our sleeves and take just a realistic approach. What's going to be the best thing for you to do given this situation? In any case, there'll be certain things that would exacerbate it, and there's ways that you can help him move through that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great example, because on the one hand, we don't want to over psychologize it, but on the other hand, it is an observation of human psyche in these situations. One thing in your description, as you were describing that scenario, I think what often happens to me when I'm bringing something to your attention or your notice, or a correction of sorts, to me, I rarely go into that circumstance thinking I'm correcting John or I'm teaching him something. I've seen something and I'm bringing it to your attention, right? It feels a very objective thing to do.
Sure.
Look, here we have something that I'd like for both of us to look at, right? Great. So we can look at both of these things. Maybe part of it is I have an underlying fundamental confidence that, oh, that's what you want to do. And sometimes doing just that, like, oh, let's just look at this thing objectively, doesn't sufficiently take into account the psyche of the person who's on the receiving end of the information. So like you had said, um, sometimes it's embarrassing or hard if realizing there's something you didn't see. I think that is a normal human reaction for most of us. I think most of us as children, unfortunately, in the way our parents parented us, we tend to feel shame in correction. None of our parents are perfect, and certainly we're not either. And so our children
Right.
will struggle with the same thing. We're always working toward doing that in a better manner. But I think that that's just a kind of learned response to a correction or to a lack of seeing
Right.
something, is feeling a little bit embarrassed. In any case, kind of at best, you just feel embarrassed that you didn't notice, you didn't see. And so it makes a big difference, I think, for the spouse that's bringing a point to the attention of the other spouse, that you're saying, you're aware that you're putting them in a emotionally
Yep.
delicate
Yep.
situation. And it makes all the difference. Maybe the words aren't different, although very often the words you choose are actually different. But even if the words aren't different, the spirit in which you go into it makes it so much easier for the spouse to acquiesce and say, oh, tell me more about that. I'm sorry I missed that. That really takes moving forward with a sense of confidence that you are in an environment of love where being vulnerable is okay because you're safe. So
That's a hugely important point, dear. And it's funny that I'm thinking right now of something that just happened today in the correcting of one of our children. And without going into detail, because it's not necessary, I was in this situation where I was frustrated, thinking, I wish this child would just take the correction and not be defensive.
mhm.
And that is so commonly a situation. And look, let's be frank. That often happens in your and my relationship, in adult
Sure.
relationships too. It's amazing how there's
Absolutely.
certain kind of immature aspects in all of us that we have to reckon with. And I there have to be asking myself, it's only reasonable that I ask myself, could I have done this correction in a way that was less likely
Mhm.
to produce the result that I got of there being a kind of sensitivity?
Mhm.
And so kind of even going back to our opening thing of okay, say a wife who's experiencing a husband as not being on the same page, he doesn't respond well when I bring it up. I said the first thing I've asked is, well, do you bring it up? Have you first just tried in a mature, calm situation to address it? I am not going to say right here, if your husband's not listening to you, then clearly you're doing this in too aggressive a way.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that, although it is part of
Something to
it
take
to
into
be
account.
asking
Sure.
yourself,
Yeah.
have I tried my best to set this up for success?
Right.
Have
Mhm.
I tried to come in a non-accusatory way? Because it's so funny. I realize this in my interaction with my children, where clearly in so many words they're saying to me, well, Daddy, why are you accusing us? And I feel like yelling, I'm not accusing you. But actually, is there a kind of, accusatory tone? Is it
Mhm.
coming from a certain fear on my part of not being heard? Is it, whatever exactly it's coming
Mhm.
from? The reality is that's where it's going to take a certain humility on my part. Yeah, actually, I didn't set this up for
Mhm.
success. So in many ways, or this thing of not being on the same page, I love to say this. We've said this before. These kind of challenges that come along regularly in a marriage, they're part of the natural plan. They're actually part of working out this relationship. I think this is a really helpful thing. Someone might not say, really? I mean, that's like, even if it's something where I pretty clearly am seeing something that the other person just should be able to see and doesn't see, this is somehow part of the plan. In some sense, I'm going to say, yes.
Mhm.
Yes, this should be an opportunity to look closely for both of you, and how are we going to learn to love better, to communicate better, to really open our hearts to one another here.
Mhm.
It's going to be precisely on these things, that not being on the same page about about things of some significance. Again, we're not talking about probably the most fundamental things. Other things where we feel especially vulnerable, that it's especially important that we be able to communicate and that we be heard.
So two things come to mind when you say that, and want to just run them past you, see what you think about them. So the first thing, when you said, I'm not going to necessarily say that if a woman says, my husband doesn't hear me, I'm not accusing her of going about it the wrong way. So the first thing that kind of comes to mind, a distinction that might be helpful, is that there are two persons in this situation, your spouse and yourself. And when it comes down to it, of those two, you're the only one that you can change, that you have the power to change. You can create an environment that helps the other change. But when it comes down to it, you can't change other people. They have to choose to do something, right? So you're the only one you can change, which is, does that sound okay to you saying that?
Fine.
Way?
Yeah. You can act so as to help that person change.
Yeah.
You can directly change.
Yeah. And
choose
so that's
to change
why,
yourself.
in a certain sense, in talking about, well, what do I do if my spouse is not on the same page? Well, the first thing you're going to talk about, or maybe even talk about the most, is what, if I'm a wife who feels like my husband's not hearing me and needs to change, the biggest thing that's or the only thing that's really in my control is myself.
Most directly, in case, yes.
Is myself. And so that's why the conversation does circle more around the spouse who feels like he needs to see a change. What should he do? What should he do? Or what should she do?
Right,
what should you do?
right,
So that's why it's not putting all the blame
point
on that spouse.
Right. It's not just saying you've got it wrong. You've got to change because you've got it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Go.
And we can always improve. As the spouse that needs our spouse to see something, we can always improve in the way we go about that and the way we think about it. So that was the first thing. And then, oh gosh, am I going to remember the second thing I wanted to ask you?
Well, think about that for a moment. If I could, I just want to emphasize that, because as you're saying it, I was thinking, okay, the thing that could be really hard about that is because it make it sound as though, okay, all I can do is change myself. And so that means I always have to take the blame. It's not about blame. It's about just practicality of asking, again, the approach of what can I be doing here is there something in me that would make this be, that could possibly make it work better? Mm-hmm. And I like your way of putting it that way, of start with yourself, because really that is so practical. It's really striking me. It doesn't mean that for this to work, my spouse won't have to make some changes. But how can I position myself mm-hmm. to help my spouse best be able to make those changes? Because I can't make those changes for him or her.
And it
so
recognizes...
it doesn't mean I'm taking the blame, but it is saying I'm not taking responsibility as though if I, quote, fix me, then everything's going to be fine. No, I'm just doing my part in mm-hmm. calling out in love and hope and confidence mm-hmm. for her to do her part.
Because the reality is your spouse may need to change, but I can tell you 100%, so do you. So even if, let's say, the disparity is so great, and really for most fundamental things, you're seeing more the good life and what your family really needs and your spouse really doesn't see it, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be things that you need to change, right? So your spouse needs to change, but I can tell you 100% for sure, all of us need to change. And so it's an invitation.
Absolutely.
So I remember the other thing I was going to ask you. So the other thing that you mentioned is, when one, or it made me think of this when you were saying this, when one spouse is behind the other, so to speak, in kind of maybe particular ideals or desires or goals for the family, for the marriage, et cetera. And yours are maybe a little bit far more developed and a little bit more ahead.
It certainly happens. We're no way denying this here, that some are sometimes in some real sense, quote, ahead of the other.
Yeah, most frequently that's the case. Yeah. There's a discrepancy there. So I'm just going to use an example of where the discrepancy is larger. And obviously that's extremely painful. It just struck me that because what is primary in the marriage is the relationship, not the acquisition or the meeting or attainment of ideals, that the spouse who's maybe quote unquote farther ahead has to, in a certain sense, this is not resigning yourself to just embrace the lower standards of your spouse and, okay, well, that's just how it's going to be. But that as you're working on things, that your life together might be limited by the capacity of your spouse. This doesn't mean you let go of your ideals or your desires or whatever, but the high ideal or the goodness of the ideal doesn't justify trouncing your spouse or stomping on them or taking over their legitimate role within the family. Mm-hmm. Because what is primary here is the relationship of the spouses. And it doesn't justify you to violate their integrity as an individual
Right.
by, for example, forcing them to do the good thing
Right.
or
Right. Right.
shaming them
Right.
into
Right.
doing the right thing. That would be a really destructive blow, undercutting what is in fact fundamental to the relationship, which is the relationship of the spouses in love.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's great.
that really kind of struck me, like, someone who is ideal oriented, who really sees a good thing, can go, wow, that's so good. It's so universal. It's so absolute that it kind of justifies my coercing or manipulating. And there are a lot of really subtle ways of manipulating your spouse, or frankly, your children, into living a certain kind of way or being a certain kind of person that precludes the actual transformation of the person inside,
No,
but simply forces them to behave a certain way so that we can be, reaching this great ideal for our family or for our marriage. And that would be an incredible blow that would actually in the end destroy the relationship, first the relationship of the spouses, and then by extension the relationship of the parents with the children.
great. I want to run further with that. It struck me as you were speaking. We can be tempted to usurp the role of the other. Again, example I'm going to go with here is there's an appropriate kind of firstness in responsibility and authority in the household that the husband has, and certainly I've seen often with my own eyes a sense where a wife, again, good intentions, good ideals, has this sense of, well, look, my husband's not going to do it. I'm just going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to be careful here. Can that sometimes obtain as regards certain things or in certain ways? Perhaps, but let me state a principle. We don't want to, because you started to say it, we don't want to undermine the distinction in roles. And those the distinction of the kind of each of our place in the vocation of marriage and the household is, it's a gift, it's from nature, it's providential, and it's for the common good. It's for the good of everybody. Mm-hmm. It might seem, well, for the greater good here, I need to step up and basically just take the authority of the other person, or take the role of the other person, and just simply
do it right.
Do it right, because I'll do it myself. I'll get it done. And while that might seem to make sense for obvious reasons, that is a problem. Mm-hmm. Precisely because that distinction of roles is for the common good. And I think part of how you started to put it, that I liked how you're putting it, was I have to deal with the reality that's here. I'm married to this person. Let's make this be a little bit more spicy, because such a thing is certainly not hard to imagine. Imagine a wife frustrated that her husband isn't seeing things, kind of in maybe very good things that she sees and wants to do, and then she looks over there at the neighbors, this other couple, and wow, that husband is really, he's on board, he's leading the way, he's doing the thing himself, he understands this, he's articulating it, he's inviting his wife to go along, and they're this great team. And this is going to be a very painful situation. Mm-hmm. Could lead to temptations of a number of different kinds here. But let's just say we need to remind ourselves, I'm not married to that person. And I wouldn't choose even now to be married to that person. I've been given this particular relationship as the place in which I'm going to work out my salvation. I'm going to work out who I am. We are going to make this household together with all the limitations that we have. We didn't go out there and choose the absolute number one perfect ideal person to make this happen with. We chose this particular person that is my vocation, mm-hmm. to do this together with. Mm-hmm. And if that includes, and it often will include, let's call it compromising in some sense of the term, in some, not compromising in the negative sense, because there's
bearing a compromise,
recognizing we can only do, given where one another are, what we can do. And it can be a way of, to put it spiritually, rejecting God's will for me, rejecting the reality, mm-hmm. here, to, as it were, force it, demand that this person be something that this person is not.
Mm-hmm.
I can't make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I am called to live in this marriage, not called to live the ideal marriage.
Mm-hmm.
I'm called to do my best in this marriage with this person. That's all I can do.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very big thing to recognize and to try to do.
Yeah. And to flesh that out a little bit more, I mean, if you think about it in the very practical sense that when you come to your spouse with this kind of, I need you to be this type of thing, that loses sight of their person and the relationship, the unique relationship that no one else in the world can have with them other than you. And it's a relationship of love and vulnerability. If you come to them and you demand this of them in a way that excludes that, it's a way of looking at them and saying, if you don't do this, I won't love you anymore. Or you don't make the cut if you don't do this. There's this ideal outside of us that's so great that if you can't do that, you're cut from the team. What does that mean to cut your spouse from the? You basically have told the person you need to perform in order to be loved. And that's not what the love in marriage is.
Amen.
I love you. And even if, let's say you were, maybe you have an arranged marriage but with a good and virtuous person and you're virtuous and, maybe the spark wasn't there, but through commitment and time you say, but through the bond of marriage, I have been chosen to be that person for you. And it's exclusive. And so I will do my best to always see you that way and treat you that way, rather than holding up a standard and saying, if you don't meet that standard, oh, sorry, I closed my heart. No, this is, we can keep working on seeing the person and seeing them first as primary. I just keep thinking, wow, it's so amazing because this is the call in marriage to a relationship between the spouses. But at the same time, a little microcosm of that is think how often we do this to children. When we say you have to be a certain way, otherwise you're not acceptable, right? So we give them something to live up to, but if we do it outside of the context of remembering I'm looking at a person and I love you as a person, then that encouragement or exhortation becomes more of a condemnation than an exhortation to something bigger.
And it wouldn't be also fair to say that is also, it really makes it be about me. Mm-hmm. We don't recognize this. How often, here's what's scary to me, but by the grace of God, we're going to be all right. But it's okay to be scared by, in a sense, by things that are scary. Is this a matter of selfishness where we can cloak our self-centeredness in high ideals? Mm-hmm. And the kind of high ideal and it's not that I justify being selfish, right? But I justify what is a form of being selfish. We do that. It really struck me as you're talking about how often do we make this mistake with children of demanding something of them. Very often when we're forgetting them, it's because we're thinking of ourselves. Mm-hmm. I want to be a successful parent. I want to be seen as a successful parent. Therefore, you need to perform in this way. Otherwise, you are unacceptable. This is actually a form of, though it might be about our ideals are right, about what we're calling that person to be. We're not calling that person to be that for that person's sake, but for my sake. Mm-hmm. And so now I think that very often could sneak in here, maybe even drive in either one, where a spouse is finding it unacceptable that the other spouse isn't doing such and such. It's like we're forgetting the spouse. We're making it kind of be about what I demand that this marriage be, regardless of whether you are there or not. But if it's a marriage, you have to be there.
Exactly. And that's going to be the limiting factor. And the reality is limitations are actually wonderful. I'm not saying the limitations of vice, or sin, but the reality is that when we're limited, it allows the other person. So I just think of the boundaries of our person, or even our bodies. Because I'm limited, it means that there's someone else. If I were unlimited, there would be no one else. And so I can encounter people. So you can look at your limits as kind of a certain blessing. It's a hard outline that, wow, how do I meet that? And it really, if we go into encountering those differences and limitations as a loving gift, and how do we go into that so both of us can change and flourish, then those differences actually become a blessing to the marriage.
Amen. And now someone might not be thinking, okay, but look, all right, fine, that's all nice, but I mean, can I try to get the other to catch up a little bit here or not? I mean, can I try to bring the other person? Of course, the answer is obviously yes. And so maybe we can just move towards wrapping up by saying, addressing here in our last segment. Okay, but I mean, given that we've emphasized self-reflection, self-knowledge, are we approaching this in a way that's going to help the other person see? Dot dot dot. Is it nonetheless reasonable, and how might we go about trying to help that other person grow towards an ideal that in God's providence we have seen? I mean, this. So let's put it this way. Start with this. It's certainly part of the natural plan. I've expanded this. I said, put it this way. You have at times, doesn't matter what the example is, come and said, I think it's important that we do this for our children, do this in our home for our children. And let's just say when a time this has gone well, that I look at that and come by the grace of God, go, oh my goodness, yes, all right. This has come to me through you. It was key that you came to me with the confidence and you were able to help move us forward together precisely by presenting it. I see it and we go towards it. So certainly part of what we're addressing here, if what if my spouse is not on the same page? Well, one main manifestation of that is going to be, well, this is going to be naturally happening all the time, where one of us has had an insight, had an inspiration that we do need to bring to the other. And so so it's fine to have that confidence. I want to do all that I can while always remaining humble and realizing maybe I don't see this completely fully. Nonetheless, I do have confidence that there's something here where in God's providence, I have seen something more clearly. There's something that I want to go after. And it's my place right now to bring that to the other. Well, okay, practically speaking, first of all, I think let's go back to the beginning and bear in mind everything that we've said. It's about relationship. I'm purifying my own intentions. I'm making sure that I'm coming in humility. I'm making sure that I'm sharing out of love. I'm making sure that I'm sharing in such a way that is inviting the other person and not accusing the other person. Why do we need to get accusatory? Because the other person hasn't yet seen what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think can we? It always, let's take the high road. There's not necessarily something wrong with my spouse. In God's providence, I have the opportunity to have the gift of being the instrument to bring that person along. Am I, while doing that, going to be aware that might well go the other way? But what if in God's providence that it in this particular marriage, it's more often going to be the one than the other, and that's going to be me. Say, okay, fine, there it is. So in all humility, I accept that. I think that's where it's, I love the words of, I think this kind of applies here, where Saint Therese, the little flower, at one point said, I need to remember, if I've been preserved from sin, that's ultimately the same mercy of God that forgives others who have sinned. Mm-hmm. By analogy here, if I have come to a greater insight, that's by this same divine mercy, same divine
generosity
gift and generosity, whereby if I respond well, to some extent, others will be able to be brought forward by this. But if I treat it as though I'm on my high horse, why aren't other people where I am? I'm actually failing, not being true to the gift that I've been given. Mm-hmm. And we don't know. We don't know how the other's going to respond. Am I called upon to suffer and to suffer with that person, not leave that person behind? So I'm not giving an ultimatum, but I'm coming in love and saying, again, this is This is important to me. This is something I really want to share with you. Have we really done that?
Mm-hmm.
Experiencing the other as not being on the same page is a call to try again to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to kind of draw that out a little bit, let's say you're in the process of working on this. I'm just going to use a very practical example. For example, the things that you talk about on LifeCraft of shaping the home, a lot of these things have really inspired so many people about coming to realize more what it means to be human in the context of a household. It's kind of is a different way of looking at things, a different way of investing the ordinary functions of life with a new kind of importance, which is for a lot of people, it's kind of a revelation. Wow, I could do this in my daily thing. And very often it's one or the other of the spouses sees it first and is bringing the other along. And the other can be coming along at varying rates. And so that can be very frustrating for the one who's seen more and really wants to do more of these really human activities in the household. And the other one's just isn't motivated to make that happen because they don't see it yet. So yes, as you said, it's always a conversation. It's always an invitation for more conversation, for meeting in love through conversation. But in the meantime, what does the spouse do to bring some of these great insights that they've now had? And I'm just using LifeCraft as an example. It can be in any other things that we're learning about and growing in all the time. And it strikes me that, while on the one hand, your stride is being limited by the stride of your spouse, so to speak, as Alice von Hildebrand said to us one time when we were recording, she said, well, if someone has a shorter stride, the one with the longer stride has to accommodate the one with the shorter stride, because the one with the shorter stride can't, right?
It's a great image.
They can't make their stride longer.
And it's about walking together.
And it's about walking together.
One of us getting quickly somewhere without the other person.
Exactly. Or breaking the other person to get there. And so it strikes me that while you're waiting for the other person to come, that doesn't mean that you can't live these new truths, these new convictions until they're there and ready to do it. And I think the key is to kind of begin to discern what's at the heart of these things. If we're learning things that are true and real and good, they're just true and real and good, even if you're only able to practice them in a limited fashion because maybe you are with someone who has a shorter stride. If we understand the spirit of why they're good, then we begin to discover little ways in which we can incorporate them into our life as an expression or reflection of maybe what is just a little part of what is ultimately our bigger goal. So it's not like you despair and go, well, my spouse has this shorter stride, and so, we just can't talk about table manners. Okay, so maybe table manners is a flashpoint because it was something that your spouse was really abused with when they were a child and is just not ready to bring table manners into the family. Well, is it possible that if you understand the concept of why table manners are such a gift in the household, that you just take care to set the table with a little bit more dignity, or have it be a place where there's no contention or arguing over the dinner table, or you put a vase of flowers on the table. So these are small things that are informed by what are these goals or ideals that we're trying to meet anyway? What do they consist in? If it's about creating a table where everyone comes in a peaceful serenity and harmony, well, maybe we can't discuss how you hold your fork and your knife and where you put your napkin because your spouse has issues or baggage around that. But you could do things that don't have necessarily to do with the fork and the table and the knife, of just making things lovely, or creating or yourself bringing a spirit to the table of welcomingness. So I think it's not to despair, because your spouse his stride may never stretch, or her stride may never stretch to be yours in certain things in your life. But it's your job, or kind of your task or your privilege, to try to understand what's the kernel, what's at the heart of what I'm trying to achieve. How can I bring that spirit into the places where I am free to do that, even though I'm being limited by my spouse's ability?
I think that's a great way of putting it. Let's quickly just throw out a couple other very concrete examples. Someone has come to the conviction that what music we listen to in the home is super important. You go to the spouse, well, hey, can we make this be our practice? Can we not have this other music in the house? The spouse isn't ready for that. Okay, well, this could become a point of contention, or it could be a point where, in the spirit of what you just said, the one spouse says, all right, All right. Well, how can I try to live this the best that I can right now? Not in a subversive way, not in
Or
a way
condemning way or
it
accusatory.
is exactly condemning or accusatory, but just not giving the royal hurt, frown, and grimace
Well,
when
I'm just going to.
when the
Yeah.
spouse puts on that other music. I mean, these would be hard things. How about how about technology? One of the spouses comes to the real conviction, we really need to be limiting our family use of this such and such technology. We need to be saying to the children, um, ask you to do this or to not do this.
Mm-hmm.
The other spouse is just not ready for that. Well, okay. Again, this is going to be hard, and I think it's okay, particularly if it's a very important thing, which it certainly can be, that you take that to prayer. You're bringing it up. You're explaining it. I mean, this is where using all your power of never being the one who's going to kind of cut and run. It's always still going to be about us. It's the ideals are not going to separate us here, though it might be a genuine suffering. And you don't have to compromise, pretend as though it's not important to you. That would be not being true to yourself. If you've seen something is very important about the technology or the music or how we're recreating together, how we're observing Sunday,
Mm-hmm.
you want to aim for something higher. Well, okay, and you're kind of making that case. The other spouse isn't up for it.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the again, that it not be unnecessarily a bone of contention. Well, what can we do together? Be the winning one that keeps making a
Yeah.
case in a non harping way.
Yeah. It's such an incredibly fine line, this marriage thing that really demands of us to be excellent at it, like in the sense of like being able to stay on that fine line, because, whatever things you do to be able to live according to your highest conviction in small ways, it's also extremely important that they never become a subtle form of coercion. So it's like it's so hard in our interrelationship with other people, but it really comes to roost with your spouse, because that's where the relationship is the closest. So often we do good things in a spirit of coerciveness, like, oh, well, if I do this, he'll change his mind. That can't be the motivation. And it's
Well, there's nothing wrong with the motivation to have him change his mind.
Well, it's okay to hope that he changes his mind, but not I'm going to do this so that he changes his mind.
Or to force him to. Is
exactly.
it okay?
That's what I mean by coercion.
Is it all right? But is it okay to be doing it, to be inviting him, to be hoping that he sees something different here?
But this is what I mean. It's a razor edge, and it requires us to be excellent, because there's a very fine distinction between, yes, do the good things to provide an environment where the seed can blossom, can grow and blossom, but versus doing the identical action for the sake of changing them or manipulating the environment so that he does, in the end, does what you want him to do. So again, it's a super subtle thing, and it's a very fine line that's actually worth thinking about, because it's kind of a tension that makes us excellent and better honed, most especially because it demands of us to always keep looking at the other.
So, amen. Dare I, in before we close, to bring up, there is a certain asymmetry given the first authority in the home of the husband, and maybe that we just have to hold that one of a wife is kind of, say, hoping, inviting, coaxing, not forcing, her husband to lead in a certain way. Where if she has a higher ideal, but if on the other side, what if the husband really is ready to move forward with such and such, but the wife isn't? He has first authority. There is a certain asymmetry there where
he can actually institute things.
I mean, at least
on the one hand, but I'm going to tell you,
I wasn't saying that means he can just move forward. I'm saying how do we address this? Because I don't think he just, I have first authority. So I just, in this case where she disagrees with me, I just move ahead. No, that's not the answer. And he can't just move ahead without her.
And even if he were to abuse that first authority by doing that, it would not succeed.
I wouldn't. No,
because the project of marriage has to be two people working together for the sake of the flourishing of the other and the rest of the community. And it's not about getting marching orders straight.
No,
So
right.
that's why, in a certain sense, there is an asymmetry, but it's an asymmetry of roles, which we could also describe as a difference in roles, because in the end, his first authority, if used in autonomy and not respecting the other, isn't going to achieve the result anyway.
No, it's not.
So,
but and again, we're not going to be able to give this sufficient consideration, but I think it is at least worth noting that there might be a situation where he is asking himself, particularly a more serious situation, dear, I think we need to move forward on such and such, and I'm going to ask you. I know at this point I haven't convinced you here, but I'm going to ask you to join me. I mean, you see what I'm going there.
But I'm just going to say, historically, by example, when we've had that situation in our family, if I don't actually see what you're asking, it hasn't worked out very well.
It doesn't work out very well. And this, and
I mean, we can testify to that, until there is an interior gaining a vision on my part.
Right.
And we've certainly had that situation where for years it's just been okay. And then finally, like a dawning, I understand what you're asking of me and I participate in it in a different way. The results are so dramatically different.
They are.
So, it really,
Well, the whole thing of kind of the kind of initiating versus the receptive there. Yeah. I mean, that's where there's the divergence, the not being on the same page, it is addressed in slightly different ways.
Yes,
I mean,
agree.
and we could just at least say generally. I mean, a wife is in many ways inviting the husband to take the lead in certain things, and if she obviously can't force that. At the same time, a husband is inviting a wife to receive certain things,
to take part in something that he's
and he
leading.
He cannot force it.
Yeah.
So what does
slightly
each
different
one
contours
do
yes.
in that situation where you can't force the other person?
It seems to me that the remedy for both is the same, in that he has to go back to conversation, right? To the spouses having the continual commitment where there is a lack of mutual vision, to keep bringing it up to one another so that you can begin to understand the other better.
I agree. And maybe this is just a little bit of a controversial, difficult point to end on, but I do think part of sometimes a husband's authority can include that he sees something where even now there's not, at least there could be instances where there's not agreement, but he's going to say, I think we need to move forward on this because I think we have an obligation in view of the good that we're working on here together. I mean, this is part of, I think, why there is ultimately a first authority, because in certain concrete circumstances, if there isn't agreement, you can't necessarily just wait for consensus. And so
that does make it asymmetrical between husband and wife.
There is a certain asymmetry there, but we have to be very careful with that, because it's not simply like, the general in the army who just moves forward in view of his. Even there, it's very important that he try to get the subordinates on board. This is not. That's not the way it is in a marriage. It's never just a husband trying to get his wife on board, because it's always two fundamentally equal people doing a shared project in which one has first authority. There's no other instance of authority that's directly analogous to that. It has some similarities with a hierarchy in the military, but some very big differences there, Ken, particularly given that this is a fully shared project of the two of us fundamentally as equals. But unto that end, one of us has first authority.
Well, it sounds like that's totally begging another conversation or discussion that specifically deals with the difference between first authority and second authority. It sure does.
But in any case, right now, thank you, dear, for spending a little time. Thanks for joining us on this issue of what if our spouse is not on the same page. Take care and see you next time. Thanks for tuning in this episode of The Intentional Household. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review. If you have any topic requests, please send them to lifecraftgroup@gmail.com. For our Wednesday reflections, free courses, reading groups, and live events, please visit life-craft.org.